The dust swirled in the beam of Marcus Chen's flashlight like ghosts dancing in forgotten time. He stood at the threshold of room 237 in the old Bellmont Hotel, his hand trembling on the brass doorknob that hadn't turned in 65 years. Behind him, the demolition crew waited with crowbars and sledgehammers, ready to tear down this relic of Philadelphia's golden age. But Marcus couldn't move, because through the crack in the door he could see something that made his breath catch in his throat. A child's teddy bear sitting in a rocking chair, positioned as if someone had just set it down moments ago, not 6 decades earlier. The hotel manager, an elderly woman named Mrs. Castellano, had been adamant. "That room hasn't been opened since November 15, 1960, she'd said, her wrinkled hands clutching a ring of ancient keys. The owner, Mr. Samuel Bellmont, locked it himself and gave strict instructions. No one was ever to enter. No cleaning staff, no maintenance, no one. He paid the property taxes on this building for 40 years just to keep that room sealed. When he died, the trust kept paying. Now the money's run out and the building's being demolished. But before you tear it down, you should know what you're destroying." Marcus had thought she was being dramatic, a sentimental old woman trying to delay the inevitable. Historic buildings fell every day in the name of progress. This one was no different, or so he'd believed until he'd broken the seal on that door and felt the weight of decades pressing against him like a physical force. What he didn't know, what he couldn't know standing there in that dusty hallway with his demolition crew growing impatient behind him, was that opening room 237 would unravel a mystery that had haunted Philadelphia for 65 years. It would reveal a love story so profound that it had stopped time itself. It would expose secrets that powerful people had worked for decades to bury, and it would force Marcus to confront the most painful chapter of his own past, the one he'd spent the last 20 years trying to forget. This is the story of what Marcus found in that room. This is the story of why it had been sealed for 65 years. And this is the story of how the past, no matter how deeply we bury it, always finds a way back to the surface. The sealed room. Marcus Chen had been in the demolition business for 15 years, and he'd learned early on not to get sentimental about buildings. Brick and mortar, wood and glass, they were just materials, not memories. When a structure outlived its usefulness, you tore it down and built something new. That was progress. That was life. But standing in the lobby of the Bellmont Hotel on that gray October morning in 2025, Marcus felt something he rarely allowed himself to feel: hesitation. The Bellmont had been grand once. You could still see it in the ornate ceiling moldings, the marble floors cracked but still elegant, the sweeping staircase that curved up to the second floor like something from a movie. Built in 1925, the hotel had hosted presidents and movie stars, jazz legends and literary giants. The walls had witnessed 100 years of Philadelphia history. Now it was just another condemned building in Marcus's portfolio, scheduled for demolition to make way for luxury condominiums. He'd done this 100 times before. So why did this one feel different? "Sir Chen?" Mrs. Castellano's voice pulled him from his thoughts. She was 87 years old, the hotel's manager for the past 40 years, though there hadn't been guests in decades. She'd stayed on as caretaker, paid by the mysterious trust that had kept the building maintained but closed. "Before your crew starts, there's something you need to see." Marcus checked his watch. The demolition was scheduled to begin at 9 a.m. It was already 8:30. "Mrs. Castellano, I appreciate the history, but we're on a tight timeline." "Room 237, she interrupted, her dark eyes intense. "You need to see it before you destroy it." Something in her tone made Marcus pause. He gestured to his foreman, a burly man named Jake, to give them a moment. "What's special about room 237? Mrs. Castellano pulled out a ring of keys from her cardigan pocket, selecting one that looked older than the others. Its brass tarnished nearly black. "This room has been sealed since November 15, 1960. 65 years ago today, actually. The date isn't a coincidence. I called you here specifically for today. Mr. Samuel Bellmont, the hotel's owner, locked that door himself and left instructions that it was never to be opened. Never cleaned, never inspected, never entered for any reason." Marcus frowned. "That's a fire code violation, a health hazard." "Mr. Bellmont paid significant amounts of money to city officials to look the other way," Mrs. Castellano said bluntly. And when he died in 1988, his trust continued to pay. The building has been closed to the public since 1975, maintained but vacant, all because of that one room. Why? Marcus asked, his curiosity finally overtaking his impatience. That's what I want you to see, Mrs. Castellano said. Before you tear this building down, before you destroy the last physical evidence of what happened here, you should know the truth. You should understand what you're erasing. Against his better judgment, Marcus followed Mrs. Castellano up the grand staircase. His footsteps echoed in the empty building. Dust motes danced in the weak sunlight filtering through grimy windows. The second-floor hallway stretched before them, doors lining both sides, all of them open or ajar, except one. Room 237 stood at the end of the hall, its door firmly closed, a strip of yellowed paper sealing the frame. The seal bore an official-looking stamp and a signature Marcus couldn't read. "Mr. Bellmont put that seal there himself," Mrs. Castellano said softly. "He told me that night. I was just a young cleaning girl then, 22 years old. He told me that what was in that room was sacred, that it was a monument to something beautiful that the world had tried to destroy. He made me promise to guard it, to make sure no one ever disturbed it." "And you kept that promise for 65 years?" Marcus asked, incredulous. "I did," Mrs. Castellano said simply, "but now the building is coming down. The trust money is gone and there's no saving it, so before it's destroyed someone should know. Someone should bear witness." She held out the key to Marcus. He stared at it for a long moment before taking it. The metal was cold in his palm. "Are you sure about this?" he asked. "If it's been sealed for 65 years, there could be anything in there. Mold, structural damage, biohazards." "Open the door, Mr. Chen," Mrs. Castellano said. "Then decide whether this building deserves to be demolished or deserves to be remembered." Marcus inserted the key into the lock. It resisted at first, the mechanism frozen by decades of disuse. He had to force it, feeling the tumblers reluctantly give way. The seal tore with a sound like a sigh. When he turned the handle and pushed, the door opened with surprising smoothness, as if it had been waiting for this moment. The smell hit him first, not decay or mold as he'd expected, but something fainter. Old perfume, cigarette smoke, and underneath it all, the peculiar scent of time itself, that dusty paper smell of decades sealed away from the world. Marcus stepped inside and stopped, his breath catching. The room was frozen in time, preserved like an exhibit in a museum. A double bed dominated the space, its covers pulled back as if someone had just gotten out of it. On the nightstand, a glass of water sat next to an ashtray with a lipstick-stained cigarette butt. Women's clothing was draped over a chair, a beautiful blue dress, stockings, shoes placed neatly beside them. A man's suit hung on the closet door, but it was the details that made Marcus's skin prickle. The calendar on the wall showed November 1960. A newspaper lay on the desk, dated November 15, 1960, its headlines screaming about the election of John F. Kennedy. 2 suitcases sat by the door, packed and ready for a journey that never happened. And in the rocking chair by the window sat a teddy bear, its Tutton eyes catching the light as Marcus's flashlight beam swept across it. "My God," Marcus whispered. "It's like they just stepped out." "They didn't step out," Mrs. Castellano said from the doorway. Her voice was heavy with old sorrow. "They were taken." Marcus turned to look at her. "What happened here?" Mrs. Castellano entered the room slowly, reverently, like she was entering a church. She walked to the desk and picked up a photograph that Marcus hadn't noticed, one of several scattered across the surface. She held it up for him to see. The black and white photo showed a young couple, both black, both beautiful. The woman wore the blue dress that now hung over the chair. She was laughing at something, her head thrown back, joy radiating from every inch of her. The man beside her gazed at her with such obvious love that it made Marcus's chest ache to look at it. "Evelyn Monroe and James Holloway," Mrs. Castellano said softly. "She was a jazz singer, one of the most talented I've ever heard. He was a doctor, educated at Howard University, brilliant and kind. They met at a concert in 1958 and fell in love immediately. Deeply, completely in love. The kind of love that changes you." She set the photo down carefully, exactly where it had been. "But this was 1960, Mr. Chen, And interracial couples, especially black couples who dared to be successful, who dared to be happy, they weren't welcome everywhere. Even in Philadelphia, even in a supposedly progressive city. Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. What happened to them? They were staying here at the Bellmont because they were getting married, Mrs. Castellano continued. November 16, 1960, was supposed to be their wedding day. They'd kept it quiet, just a small ceremony with close friends. But someone found out. Someone who didn't think a black couple should be staying in this hotel, who didn't think they should be getting married, who didn't think they deserved happiness. She walked to the window and looked out at the Philadelphia skyline, so changed from what it had been 65 years ago. On the night of November 15, 1960, the night before their wedding, someone came to this room. I was working the night shift. I heard shouting, breaking glass, Evelyn screaming. By the time I got upstairs with security, the door was open and the room was empty. Evelyn and James were gone. There was blood on the floor. You can still see the stain if you look carefully by the bed, and signs of a struggle. But no bodies. No witnesses except me, and I'd only heard voices, hadn't seen faces. Marcus looked down, and sure enough, there was a dark stain on the wooden floor beside the bed, barely visible in the dim light but undeniable once you knew to look for it. The police investigated, Mrs. Castellanos said bitterly, or pretended to. They took statements, filed reports, but this was 1960. A black couple disappearing from a hotel? The investigation was perfunctory at best. The official conclusion was that Evelyn and James had run off together, gotten cold feet about the wedding, left town. Never mind the blood. Never mind the packed suitcases they'd left behind. Never mind that neither of them ever contacted their families again, never touched their bank accounts, never appeared anywhere ever again. They were murdered, Marcus said quietly. It wasn't a question. Almost cert. Ainley, Mrs. Castellano confirmed. But their bodies were never found. No one was ever charged. And the truth was buried along with them wherever they are. And Mr. Bellmont sealed the room? Samuel Bellmont was the hotel owner, yes, but he was also James Holloway's closest friend. They'd grown up together, attended Howard together. Samuel was supposed to be the best man at the wedding. Mrs. Castellano's voice cracked slightly. When the police closed the investigation, when it became clear that no one was going to face justice for what happened, Samuel sealed this room. He said it would be a monument to Evelyn and James, a place where their love would be remembered even if the world wanted to forget they'd ever existed. He kept this building running at a loss for years, then kept it maintained even after it closed, all to preserve this room. He spent his fortune and his life guarding this memorial. Marcus looked around the room with new eyes. This wasn't just a sealed room, it was a time capsule, a protest, a memorial, a love letter to two people who'd been stolen from the world. He walked slowly around the space, taking in more details. There were wedding rings on the dresser, still in their box. Sheet music on the piano in the corner, Evelyn's handwriting on the margins. Medical journals on the nightstand on what must have been James's side of the bed. A whole life about to begin, frozen at the moment it had been torn away. "Why show me this now?" Marcus asked. "Why not take this to the media, to historians, to someone who could preserve it?" "I tried," Mrs. Castellano said. "Over the years I tried. But who cares about a 60-year-old cold case? Who cares? About two black victims from before the Civil Rights Act? I contacted journalists, historians, civil rights organizations. Some expressed polite interest. None followed through. The world has moved on, Mr. Chen. The world doesn't want to remember its ugly history. It wants to tear it down and build something shiny and new on top of it." She looked at him directly, her eyes intense. "But you're here. You're the one tearing it down. So before you do, before you erase the last evidence that Evelyn Monroe and James Holloway ever existed, ever loved each other, ever mattered, I wanted someone to know. I wanted someone to bear witness to what was lost." Marcus felt the weight of that responsibility settle on his shoulders. He pulled out his phone and started taking pictures, documenting everything. The room, the belongings, the photographs, the bloodstain. Every detail. "Tell me everything you remember," he said. "Everything about that night, about Evelyn and James, about the investigation. I want to know all of it." Mrs. Castellano's face showed surprise, then something like relief. "You'll delay the demolition?" "I'll do more than that," Marcus said, a determination building in his chest that he hadn't felt in years. "I'm going to find out what happened to them. I'm going to give Evelyn, Monroe, and James Holloway the investigation they deserved 65 years ago." What Marcus didn't say, what he couldn't bring himself to articulate yet, was why this case had grabbed him so completely. It wasn't just professional curiosity or historical interest. It was something deeper, more personal. Because 20 years ago, Marcus had lost someone he loved. His husband, David, had been killed in a hate crime, beaten to death outside a bar by men who thought loving another man deserved a death sentence. The case had gone cold. No arrests were ever made. Marcus had spent years trying to forget, trying to move on, throwing himself into work and building emotional walls so thick that nothing could hurt him again. But standing in room 237, looking at the evidence of another love destroyed by hatred, Marcus felt those walls cracking. He felt the old pain, the old rage, the old desperate need for justice that he'd tried so hard to bury. Maybe he couldn't bring David's killers to justice. Maybe that ship had sailed. But he could do this. He could solve this case. He could give Evelyn and James what they deserved, and maybe, in doing so, find some peace for himself. Over the next several hours, Mrs. Castellano told Marcus everything she remembered. She'd been 22 years old in 1960, newly immigrated from Italy, working as a cleaning girl at the Bellmont to send money back to her family. She'd seen Evelyn and James arrive 2 days before the wedding, seen how in love they were, how happy. Evelyn would sing while she got ready, Mrs. Castellano remembered, a sad smile on her face. Beautiful jazz standards. I'd make excuses to clean the hallway just to hear her. And James, he was so proud of her, so supportive. You could see it in how he looked at her. Like she was the sun, and he was just grateful to be in her light. On the night of November 15th, Mrs. Castellano had been working the front desk. Around 10 p.m., she'd seen 3 men enter the hotel. White men, well-dressed, not guests. They'd asked for room 237 specifically. "I told them the guests weren't receiving visitors," Mrs. Castellano said, "but they pushed past me, went upstairs. I called for security, but we only had one guard on duty and he was elderly, not equipped to handle trouble. By the time we got upstairs, maybe 5 minutes later, those men were gone and so were Evelyn and James." "Can you describe the men?" Marcus asked, already knowing the answer would be vague after 65 years. But Mrs. Castellano surprised him. She walked to the desk and pulled out a drawer. From it, she extracted a yellowed piece of paper, carefully preserved in plastic. "I drew them," she said. "The next day, when the police barely seemed interested, I sat down and drew what I remembered. I was an art student before I had to leave school to work. I'm not professional, but I got the basics." She handed the drawings to Marcus. There were 3 sketches, surprisingly detailed. 3 white men, probably in their 30s or 40s. One with a distinctive scar on his cheek, another with heavy-lidded eyes and slicked-back hair. The third was broader, taller, with a square jaw and what looked like a military bearing. "Did you show these to the police?" Marcus asked. "Of course," Mrs. Castellano said bitterly. "They barely glanced at them. Said sketches from memory weren't evidence, filed them away and forgot about them. But I kept my copies. I've kept everything related to that night. 50 boxes worth of newspaper clippings, my own investigation notes, everything I could gather over the years. It's all in the basement." Marcus felt his pulse quicken. "You've been investigating this for 65 years?" "Not actively, not always," Mrs. Castellano admitted. "But I've never forgotten. I've collected everything I could find about Evelyn and James, about the hotel, about hate crimes in Philadelphia in that era. I've tried to identify those 3 men from my sketches. I've looked for any evidence of what happened. I've carried this for 6.5 decades, Mr. Chen. I'm 87 years old. This is my last chance to see justice done." "Show me the boxes," Marcus said. They spent the rest of the day in the basement, going through Mrs. Castellano's meticulous collection. She documented everything. Newspaper articles about Evelyn's singing career, James's medical school records, the police reports from the disappearance, which Marcus read with growing disgust at their perfunctory nature. Interviews Mrs. Castellano had conducted herself over the years with people who'd known the couple. One box was dedicated to attempting to identify the 3 men from the sketches. Mrs. Castellano had collected photos of known white supremacist groups active in Philadelphia in 1960, police officers who'd been suspected of Klan affiliations, local businessmen who'd opposed integration. It was impressive, obsessive work. "This is incredible," Marcus said, surrounded by 6 decades of amateur detective work. "This is a complete investigation, more thorough than what the police did." "But I never found them," Mrs. Castellano said, frustration evident in her voice. "I never identified the 3 men. I never found out what happened to Evelyn and James's bodies. I never got answers." Marcus looked up from the box he was examining. "Mrs. Castellano, I need to ask you something. Why me? Why show this to me specifically? You could have called the police, the FBI, journalists. Why wait until the building was about to be demolished and then show it to the demolition contractor?" Mrs. Castellano was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "I did my research on you, Mr. Chen. I know about your husband. I know about what happened to David. I know the case was never solved." Marcus felt like he'd been punched. He rarely talked about David, had built his entire life around not talking about David. "How?" "I'm old, not blind," Mrs. Castellano said gently. "I saw the look in your eyes when you entered room 237. I saw recognition, pain. I knew you'd understand. I knew you'd care. Because you know what it's like to lose someone to hatred and have no one care enough to bring the killers to justice." Marcus's throat was tight. "That doesn't qualify me to investigate a 65-year-old murder." "No," Mrs. Castellano agreed. "But it means you won't give up. It means you'll fight for them the way you wish someone had fought for David." "Am I wrong?" Marcus couldn't answer. Because she wasn't wrong. Standing in that sealed room, seeing the evidence of a love destroyed, he'd felt something wake up inside him that had been dormant for 20 years. The need for justice, the need for truth, the need to make something right in a world that was so often wrong. "I'll need to bring in professionals," Marcus said finally. "Real investigators. Maybe a cold case unit, forensic experts." "Do whatever you need to do," Mrs. Castellano said. "I'll help however I can. But please, Mr. Chen, please don't let this die with me. Don't let Evelyn and James be forgotten." "I won't," Marcus promised. "I'll find out what happened to them. I'll make sure people know their story. He stopped as something in one of the boxes caught his eye. It was a photograph, different from the others, a group photo from what looked like a police department event, dated 1958. Marcus picked it up, studying it carefully. And there, in the back row, was a face he recognized from Mrs. Castellano's sketches, the man with the scar on his cheek, wearing a police uniform. "Oh my God," Marcus breathed. One of them was a cop. Mrs. Castellano came to look over his shoulder. Her hand flew to her mouth. "I've looked at that photo 100 times. How did I never see it?" "Because you were looking at it as a whole group," Marcus said, his mind racing. "Not at individuals." "But this is him, isn't it? The man with the scar?" "It could be," Mrs. Castellano said, excitement and trepidation mixing in her voice. "It's been so long, and I only saw him briefly, but yes, that could absolutely be him." Marcus turned the photo over. On the back, in faded ink, was a list of names corresponding to the people in the photo. He found the man with the scar, Officer Robert Patterson, 12th Precinct. "Officer Robert Patterson," Marcus repeated. "That's our first solid lead in 65 years. He pulled out his phone and started making calls, first to Jake, his foreman, telling him the demolition was postponed indefinitely, then to a private investigator he knew who specialized in cold cases, then to a journalist friend who covered civil rights issues. By the time night fell, Marcus had assembled a team, and he'd made a decision. He wasn't just investigating this case, he was going to solve it. He was going to find out what happened to Evelyn Monroe and James Holloway. He was going to identify their killers and expose them, even if they were dead, even if it was only their names and reputations that could be punished now. Because some debts never expire. Some crimes demand justice no matter how many years have passed, and some loves deserve to be remembered, honored, and avenged. As Marcus stood in room 237 that night, looking at the wedding rings that had never been worn, he made a silent promise to 2 people he'd never met. "I'll find the truth," he whispered. "I'll make sure the world knows what happened to you. I'll make sure your love isn't forgotten. Behind him, Mrs. Castellano wiped tears from her eyes. For the first time in 65 years, she felt hope. The truth emerges. The investigation that followed consumed Marcus's life for the next 4 months. He put every other project on hold, ignoring the financial hit his company took, ignoring the concerned calls from his business partners. Nothing mattered except solving this case. The first step was researching Officer Robert Patterson. Marcus's private investigator, a sharp woman named Teresa Rodriguez, tracked down Patterson's employment records. He'd been a Philadelphia police officer from 1955 to 1968, working primarily in districts with large black populations. His record showed numerous complaints for excessive force and racial harassment, all dismissed or buried. This guy was dirty, Teresa told Marcus as they sat in his office, surrounded by the boxes Mrs. Castellano had given them. Multiple accusations of planting evidence, taking bribes, assaulting suspects. But he had protection, high-level protection. Every complaint disappeared. What happened to him after 1968? Marcus asked. That's where it gets interesting, Teresa said. He took early retirement, moved to Florida, lived there until he died in 2003. But here's the thing. He left Philadelphia suddenly, right after a federal investigation into police corruption started. It's like someone warned him to get out before the investigation reached him. Marcus studied Patterson's photo again, that scar on his cheek marking him like a brand. So we know one of the 3 men. We need to identify the others. They worked systematically through Mrs. Castellano's sketches and the photo archives they'd gathered. The second man, the one with slicked-back hair and heavy-lidded eyes, was harder to identify. But the third man, the one with military bearing, appeared in several photos from the era as a frequent presence at white supremacist rallies. It took 6 weeks, but Teresa finally identified him, Thomas Vickers, a Korean War veteran who'd returned to Philadelphia in 1954 and become involved with local hate groups. He'd worked as a security consultant for various businesses, which probably meant he'd been muscle for hire. Vickers died in 1982, Teresa reported. Car accident, though the circumstances were suspicious. Witnesses said his brakes failed, but the investigation was minimal. His widow is still alive, though, lives in a nursing home in Delaware. Let's go talk to her, Marcus said immediately. Margaret Vickers was 93 years old, confined to a wheelchair, her mind still sharp despite her body's frailty. When Marcus and Teresa arrived at the nursing home and explained why they were there, her reaction was immediate and telling. Fear. I don't know anything about that, she said quickly. Too quickly. Thomas never talked about his work. Mrs. Vickers, Marcus said gently. We're not here to accuse you of anything. We're trying to find out what happened to 2 people who disappeared in 1960. Evelyn Monroe and James Holloway. We believe your husband was involved. Margaret's hands twisted in her lap. It was a long time ago. You do know something, Teresa said. For a long moment, Margaret was silent. Then, quietly, Thomas had nightmares. For years after 1960, he'd wake up screaming. He'd say names, Evelyn and James. He'd talk about blood, about a mistake, about how it wasn't supposed to happen that way. Marcus leaned forward. What wasn't supposed to happen? I don't know the details, Margaret said, tears forming in her eyes. Thomas never told me everything, but I knew he'd done something terrible, something that haunted him. In 1982, just before he died, he got a phone call. He came back from that call pale as a ghost. He said something about, they're digging it up, they're going to find everything. Then he drove off, and his car crashed. The police said it was an accident, but I always wondered. You think he was murdered? Marcus asked. I think he knew too much, Margaret said. I think someone wanted to make sure he never talked. And after he died, men came to our house. They went through his things, took boxes of papers, photos, I don't know what all. They told me to forget everything, to say nothing. They said if I talked, my children would suffer. Who were these men? Teresa asked. I don't know, Margaret said helplessly. But they had power. You could feel it. They weren't just thugs. They were connected, important. I was too afraid to ask questions. After they left the nursing home, Marcus felt both encouraged and frustrated. They were getting closer to the truth, but the picture was becoming more complex. This wasn't just a hate crime by random bigots. There was organization behind it, power, a conspiracy to cover it up. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Marcus's journalist friend, David Kim, had written an article about the investigation, focusing on the sealed room and the disappearance of Evelyn Monroe and James Holloway. It ran in the Philadelphia Inquirer and went viral, shared across social media, picked up by national outlets. 2 days after the article appeared, Marcus got a call from a woman named Dorothy Price. She was 89 years old, living in Atlanta, and she'd been Evelyn Monroe's best friend. "I've waited 65 years for someone to care about what happened to Evelyn," Dorothy said when Marcus called her back. "I've prayed for this day." They spoke for 3 hours. Dorothy told Marcus things about Evelyn that Mrs. Castellano hadn't known. Evelyn had been receiving threats in the weeks before the wedding. Anonymous letters telling her not to marry James, warning her that your kind wasn't welcome in Philadelphia, threatening violence if the wedding proceeded. Evelyn was scared, Dorothy remembered, but she was also brave. She said she wouldn't let hatred dictate her life. She said if she couldn't marry the man she loved openly, without fear, then what was the point of anything? "Did she keep the letters?" Marcus asked, hardly daring to hope. "She gave them to me for safekeeping, Dorothy. She was afraid if James found them, he'd call off the wedding to protect her. I've had them all these years, waiting for someone who'd take them seriously. Can you send them to me?" Marcus asked. "I'll do better than that," Dorothy said. "I'm coming to Philadelphia. I want to see that room. I want to stand where my friend stood. And I want to help you find the bastards who took her from me." Dorothy arrived in Philadelphia a week later, a dignified woman with silver hair and eyes that still sparked with the anger and grief of 65 years. Marcus took her to the Bellmont Hotel, to room 237, which he'd kept sealed except for his investigative team. When Dorothy entered the room, she broke down. She touched Evelyn's dress, the one hanging over the chair, and wept. "She was wearing this when I saw her last," she sobbed. "She twirled for me, asked if James would think she was beautiful. I told her she was the most beautiful woman I'd ever seen." After Dorothy had composed herself, she gave Marcus the letters. There were 14 of them, all typewritten, all unsigned, all filled with vicious threats. But more importantly, they contained specific details about Evelyn's schedule, her movements, the hotel where she'd be staying. The sender had been watching her, following her. Marcus's forensic document examiner analyzed the letters and determined they'd all been typed on the same typewriter, a common office model from the 1950s. But more interestingly, there were fingerprints on several of the letters, preserved all these years because Dorothy had been careful to keep them in plastic. The fingerprints were run through modern databases and, incredibly, got a hit. They belonged to a man named Richard Blackwell, who'd been fingerprinted in 1972 when he'd applied for a government job. Blackwell had been a clerk at a shipping company in 1960, but more significantly, he'd been a known associate of Robert Patterson and Thomas Vickers. Marcus felt the pieces clicking into place. Patterson the dirty cop, Vickers the muscle, and Blackwell. Blackwell might have been the organizer, the one who'd coordinated everything. Richard Blackwell was still alive, 92 years old and living in a care facility in Pennsylvania. Marcus and Teresa went to see him, bringing the letters and Patterson's photo. Blackwell's reaction when he saw them was immediate. He tried to get up and leave despite his wheelchair. "I'm not talking to you," he said, panic evident in his voice. "Mr. Blackwell, we have your fingerprints on threatening letters sent to Evelyn Monroe before her disappearance," Marcus said calmly. "We can place you with Robert Patterson and Thomas Vickers. We know you were involved. The only question is whether you cooperate or whether this becomes a criminal investigation." Blackwell's face crumpled. "You can't prosecute me. Statute of limitations?" "There's no statute of limitations on murder," Teresa said, "and we're gathering enough evidence to charge you with conspiracy to commit murder. You could spend your last days in prison, Mr. Blackwell. Or you could tell us the truth. Tell us what happened to Evelyn and James. Tell us where their bodies are. Give them the dignity of a proper burial and give their families closure." Blackwell was silent for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was weak, defeated. "It wasn't supposed to be murder," he said. "We were just supposed to scare them, make them leave town. Patterson said he'd rough them up a little, send a message. But it went wrong. Patterson and Vickers, they got carried away. There was a fight and—" He stopped, covering his face with his hands. "I wasn't even in the room. I was the lookout. But I heard it. I heard Evelyn screaming, heard James trying to fight them off. By the time I went in, they were both dead, blood everywhere. Patterson was freaking out, saying we had to cover it up, that we'd all go to prison. What did you do with their bodies? Marcus asked, his voice tight with barely controlled rage. There was a construction site, Blackwell said, tears streaming down his face. A new building going up on Market Street. We took them there late that night, buried them in the foundation before the concrete was poured the next morning. They're still there, trapped in concrete, in the basement of whatever building stands there now. Marcus felt sick. All these years, Evelyn and James had been entombed in the city they'd loved, hidden in plain sight while life went on above them. Why? He asked. Why did you target them specifically? Blackwell's answer was as ugly as Marcus had feared. Patterson had connections to some businessmen who didn't want blacks moving into certain neighborhoods, staying in certain hotels. They paid him to harass people, drive them out. Evelyn and James were high-profile, educated, successful. They were supposed to be examples. We were supposed to show that no matter how much money or education you had, if you were black, you weren't welcome. Who were these businessmen? Teresa Sked. Blackwell shook his head. I don't know names. Patterson handled that level. I just know they were important people. People with power. After that night, after we killed Evelyn and James, they made it all go away. The investigation was buried. Patterson, Vickers, and I were protected. We were told to keep quiet and we'd be taken care of, and we were until... Until what? Marcus pressed. Until the 1980s, Blackwell said. Federal investigators started looking into police corruption, into connections between cops and organized crime. People were getting nervous. Vickers was killed in that accident, he made air quotes, to keep him quiet. Patterson was forced into retirement and sent away. I was warned to destroy any evidence and keep my mouth shut. I've spent 40 years looking over my shoulder, waiting for someone to find out what we did. Marcus recorded everything, made sure it was documented. Then he contacted the Philadelphia Police Department's cold case unit. Within days, there was a forensic team at the Market Street building Blackwell had identified, using ground-penetrating radar to search the basement. And they found them. Buried in concrete, just as Blackwell had described, were the remains of two people. DNA analysis confirmed what everyone already knew in their hearts. Evelyn Monroe and James Holloway had finally been found. The news spread like wildfire. The story of the sealed room, the 65-year cover-up, the recovery of the bodies, it captured national attention. Marcus gave interview after interview, making sure that Evelyn and James weren't remembered just as victims but as people who'd loved each other, who'd had dreams and NTS and futures that had been stolen from them. Dorothy Price worked with Marcus to plan a proper funeral. Evelyn and James were laid to rest together in a beautiful ceremony attended by hundreds of people, including descendants of their families who'd never known what happened to their ancestors. Richard Blackwell was charged with conspiracy to commit murder and accessory after the fact. At 92, the likelihood of a trial was minimal, but the charges stood as a matter of record. The Philadelphia Police Department was forced to acknowledge its role in covering up the murders, to admit that officers had been complicit, and the Bellmont Hotel was saved. The publicity around the case created a groundswell of support for preserving the building as a memorial. Donors came forward, grants were secured, and within months, plans were underway to convert the Bellmont into a civil rights museum, with room 237 as its centerpiece. Mrs. Castellano lived to see the museum open. Marcus made sure she was there for the ribbon cutting, made sure she was honored for her 65 years of dedication to seeking justice for Evelyn and James. You did it, Marcus told her as they stood together in room 237, now preserved exactly as it had been but open for the world to see. You kept their memory alive. You made sure they weren't forgotten. Mrs. Castellano squeezed his hand. We did it, she corrected. You gave me hope when I thought there was none left. You finished what I started. The museum became a powerful educational space, telling not just the story of Evelyn and James, but of the countless other victims of racial violence, whose stories had never been told, whose killer had never been brought to justice. School groups visited, historians studied it, and gradually it became part of Philadelphia's reckoning with its own difficult history. For Marcus, the case changed everything. It didn't bring David back, didn't solve his husband's murder, but it gave him something he'd lost 20 years ago: purpose. He started a nonprofit dedicated to investigating cold cases involving hate crimes, particularly those whose victims had been marginalized or forgotten. He worked with police departments, families, and historians to bring closure to cases that had languished for decades. But more than that, the case healed something in Marcus. In fighting for Evelyn and James, in refusing to let their love be erased by hatred and violence, he'd honored David's memory in a way that felt meaningful. He'd turned his grief into action, his pain into purpose. On the first anniversary of the museum's opening, Marcus stood in room 237 alone. The teddy bear still sat in the rocking chair, watching over the room. The wedding rings were displayed in a glass case, symbols of a commitment that had endured beyond death. Photographs of Evelyn and James covered one wall, showing them laughing, performing, living the lives that had been cut short. Marcus thought about the people who'd tried to erase them, who'd thought that murder and concrete could make two people disappear. They'd been wrong. Love doesn't erase that easily. Truth doesn't stay buried forever. And some rooms, once sealed, demand to be opened. "Thank you," Marcus said softly, speaking to Evelyn and James, wherever they were. "Thank you for reminding me why justice matters, why love matters, why we can't ever stop fighting, can't ever stop remembering." Behind him, unheard, the old hotel seemed to sigh, as if releasing a breath it had been holding for 65 years. Room 237 was no longer a tomb. It was a testament, a reminder that every life matters, every love deserves to be honored, and every injustice, no matter how old, deserves to be confronted. The room that nobody had entered since 1960 was now entered by thousands every year. And in those visits, in those moments of silence and reflection and rage at what had been done, Evelyn Monroe and James Holloway lived on, not as victims, not as footnotes, but as what they'd always been: two people who'd loved each other deeply, who'd dared to dream of a future together, and who'd been taken too soon by hatred. Their love had been sealed in that room for 65 years, but now it was free, shared with the world, a light in the darkness that hatred could never extinguish. And that, Marcus realized, was the most powerful memorial of all. Not the preserved room or the museum, or even the solved case. It was the simple fact that people now knew Evelyn and James's names, knew their story, and would carry it forward. Some rooms are meant to be sealed, but others are meant to be opened, so the truth they hold can finally be told. Room 237 had waited 65 years to tell its story, and now finally the world was listening.